showed me to watch. Instead of asking why, start asking why not. Time flies when you're having fun. Time flies when you're lying in the sun. Bit by bit, the older that we get, the faster it tick, 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 ticks. Time flies. Whoa, whoa, time flies.
Good afternoon. Hey, Lyndall, Fraker here again with Marshfield Old School Times podcast, coming to you after being off last week. Last week was a very special weekend. We were just so busy I didn't get to get up here and do the podcast. It was our producer, Logan Fraker's 18th birthday weekend, so we had quite the event out at our place. And Logan, thanks for being our producer, and happy birthday, and for being an adult now. Welcome. Want to thank Dennis Beck for our opening number there. Time flies. Always appreciate that. So today we have a very special guest with us. They're all special, but this one's special. Kaitlyn McConnell, Marshfield native, MHS grad, 2007.
That's right.
And we're really, really happy to have her with us today. She is the author, founder, journalist, writer, preservationist, historian of Ozarks Alive. And I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about Ozarks Alive. But we really appreciate, Kaitlyn, you being here. And we're going to have some fun today. It's going to go by really fast. This is going to be one of those where I don't have to do much but sit here and listen to Kaitlyn and the stories that she has to share with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Kaitlyn, tell us about Ozarks Alive.
Well, so Ozarks Alive is kind of what I call a cultural preservation project. In other words, you might refer to it as an online magazine. It's kind of both ways I describe it, but it's basically a way for me to write stories about people, places, events in the Ozarks, both to help people see and understand and celebrate them now, but also as kind of a future documentation effort, so that 20 years ago or from now or whatever, people are able to look back and see what the Ozarks was like in this time period.
Which is exactly what I've mentioned on this show before, is what we're trying to do, is to document history. And I think we have that common bond then with that, and we really, really appreciate it. It's a very interesting podcast show, work that you do, and we do appreciate that. And again, we're tickled to death that you're from Marshfield, and that Marshfield schools helped get you where you are. So you made a statement I think it's on your website. By the way, your website is ozarksalive.com.
That's right.
It's really good. If y'all get a chance, you might look that up. But one of the statements there is the Ozarks is defined by hard work, drive, and determination, and a present built on tradition and some of the most interesting people you'll ever meet. Elaborate on that just a little bit.
I think that those of us who are from the Ozarks know that there, at least historically, has been kind of unfortunate attitudes toward what it means to be in the Ozarks. There might be people who see that hillbilly image and think, oh, that's what it means to be the Ozarks. And of course there is some of that. I don't, discount that. And the iconography is part of our culture too. But to me, the region is much more than that. And a lot of it is about a lot of hard work and a lot of drive and determination, because if you go back to the real version of that hillbilly who's sitting on the front porch smoking a corncob pipe, there were a lot of people who had to work very, very hard or they wouldn't have survived. And that really, is a couple generations in the past for some of us. Even, my own family, thinking back to what my grandmother's growing up years were like, it's a very different reality. And for them to survive and to help create the region we have now deserves to be recognized, I think, or at least preserved.
And really not that long ago, I remember as a kid having great uncles and great aunts that still had an outhouse. Whose homes were, still fairly primitive by today's standards. So it's not really been that long. Today, I think before we really get into the podcast, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself growing up in Marshfield, your 7 generations, I think, your family now in Webster County. Tell us, kind of start at the beginning if you don't care. Yeah.
Well, so the Cliff Notes version of that is that, I didn't realize how fortunate I was, in my early years, but even by the time I was in high school, realized it was really cool to be able to say that I grew up in the same house that my grandmother grew up in. I lived on a farm. My parents still live there out east of Marshfield. We actually had an Iowa address, but went to Marshfield schools all of my growing up. And, I always did, loved being in a small community, loved being able to know people and be part of kind of a close-knit place. I will say, you could still tell the difference between, I think, the country kids and the city kids, so to speak. We're going to call Marshfield a city. Because there was a sense of isolation being out there, but I liked that. I liked being able to be out in a place that was important to me and my family. But lived there my entire growing up years. Spent all my years at Marshfield schools. So started at Hubble in 1994, and I tell people it was even as I guess I would have been a 5th or 6th grader when I started thinking about this. I was really disappointed that I missed going to school in this building by 1 year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the year I went to 7th grade was the year they switched, the new high school was built.
Yeah.
But if I'd gone to school here, I would have gone in the same building that my grandmother and great-grandmother had gone to school.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So
Yeah.
it's a really cool place to be able to grow up.
Absolutely. Well, so you had brothers and sisters?
2 younger sisters.
2 younger sisters. And what were your parents' name?
Sid and Kathy McConnell.
Sid and Kathy,
Mhm.
okay. And they still live in
They
the
do.
same place, right?
Mhm.
Your family now, is that the 7th generation? Is that on your mom's side or your dad's side?
No, it's my dad's side, and
Uh-huh.
it's kind of a interesting, like, I say interesting to me, maybe
Yeah,
nobody else,
yeah,
but
no, yeah.
progression in that. So my mom's side of the family, my grandmother, her mom was a full-blooded Italian.
Okay.
So I have actually more Italian blood than hillbilly blood if you're going to break down into different, places and lineages through the Ozarks. But on my dad's side, on the Ozark side, he didn't actually grow up in Webster County, but they moved here right before I was born. So he is from Dade County, where he grew up at. My grandmother, after she graduated from high school, became a teacher, moved to Lockwood, met my grandfather, and then he was from Dade County, so she stayed there. But went back on this side through the Raider family, which most people around here
Right.
know them or are related to them. I
Right.
think there's a lot of us who are connected.
Kind of the
them.
northeast part of the county down around Rager.
Right. And, I couldn't tell you all the different moves they made in the county, but, our family farm where I grew up, I think has been in the family since around 1916 and was purchased by my great-great-grandmother, and she was kind of a testament to the old hard scrabble life. I don't, know all the details. I never knew her, of course, but, was a single mom and had to do washing for families out in the middle of the country while she raised 3 kids.
Yeah.
I don't envy a lot of the things about her life, but it's amazing to be able to learn and appreciate them now.
You betcha. And so you went to Marshfield High School, and then you kind of began working at the newspaper.
Yeah. So, and actually that started before I graduated. Maybe if he's watching this will be my thank you, but I really need to, I've always thought, and I should have already done this, reach out to Marty Edelman, who was the editor at the Marshfield Mail when I was in high school for a period of time, because he really, in a way, changed the trajectory of my life. And I'll give that cliffhanger for a second, back up a bit to explain why. When it would have been a sophomore in high school, randomly pulled a book off the shelves at the library at the school, and it was called Walk-In Preacher of the Ozarks. I kind of tell people this was a moment of divine intervention in my life, because I did not do that. I did not regularly just pull books off the shelves, but for whatever reason I did, and read this book, and it was amazing to me because it was written by this itinerant preacher named Guy Howard, who kind of wandered throughout the Ozarks, but spent a lot of time in Laclede County in, I think, the 20s and 30s, or early 1900s. And a lot of the people and places he talked about, I recognized hearing about, Laclede County, just, really close to us. And I thought, this is probably very similar to my own family and what their life was like. And that just kind of changed my whole world, made me see even the farm where I grew up in a completely different way, and it was just really life-changing. And so that got me really interested in Ozarks history. Up to then, I liked history in general, but not specifically the Ozarks, but wanted to get involved, started trying to volunteer with the Webster County Historical Society, and that led in 2005. Some people may remember there used to be a column in the Marshfield Mail called Landmarks,
Right.
which ran for a few years. And the person who had done it for a period of time was leaving for a different job. And I just told her, I don't know anything about this, but if the editor needs any help or whatever, let me know. Well, he called me in for a meeting and just said, you do it.
Really?
Yeah, I'd
Now,
never.
what were you doing there then?
Nothing. I was in high school. I was a junior in high
you
school.
weren't even at the
No.
paper yet.
No.
I see.
No, I was just a junior in high school, and he was like, okay, you do it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, because I'd never written an article. I actually didn't even like writing at the time. It was all about the history and the.
But you knew Marty.
No.
You didn't know Marty. He just called you up. So
Well,
did someone give him your name or?
Well, I told Alyssa Spradlin
Yeah,
was the person there,
right.
and I knew her, and so I said, well,
Okay.
If I could be helpful in some way,
Yeah.
and I don't remember if she gave me his number or he called me or whatever, but
Okay.
I'd never met him before. That was
Well,
the
those
first
articles
time.
were phenomenal.
Well-
I remember. I mean, you did some great stuff. How many of those did you do? You think?
Oh, geez, I think it was close to 80. It was over.
Wow, that's
it was,
a bunch.
Well, it was one a week for
Yeah.
Late
Couple years,
2005
yeah.
through 2000, late or fall
Sure,
2007. But that was the start.
That's
and
awesome.
And I'd never considered journalism before that. But it, instantly, it wasn't long, maybe a few weeks before I was like, wow, this is really cool.
That's
Being
cool.
able to
Yeah.
share that information with people
Right.
was really cool. So that's how it all started.
That's great. So you're doing these stories for the paper,
Mhm.
and then you graduate,
Mm-hmm.
and then you went to college.
I did.
Drury.
Mhm.
And you decided that you were going to
Mhm.
maybe be a journalist,
Mhm.
or at least you really found that as a career possibly.
Yes, it was, like I said, I decided I really enjoyed it probably a few weeks into it. And so by the time I was getting ready to graduate from high school, there wasn't even a debate. I was going to do journalism. I will note that, like, a point of pride for me that's still kind of surreal, but a point of pride for Webster County was right before I graduated, I was selected as the History Channel Student of the Year for that column. And so went to DC and, had a bunch of stuff out there.
Yeah.
But it was just cool to see Webster County and our history
Yeah,
recognized on that
yeah.
level, which was really, really cool.
It
But
is.
I went to jury, went straight through knowing I was going to do journalism, and kind of had this plan that after graduation, I was just going to find a job at a publication and do feature writing about the region for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
That was the plan. That plan did not work according to how I expected it to, but that was the plan
But
at the
you're
time.
you're kind of going down that path for
Mhm.
sure. So Marty, by the way, Edelman was the editor when Chad Day
Yes.
was working at the paper.
Well, and Chad
which-
was a year older than me.
Okay.
So we knew each other in
So
school.
and of course won the Pulitzer Prize, and he was our alumni, honored alumni this year at Reunion Fest. So
I was
and
very glad
Marty
to see that.
and Marty came and gave that presentation, and Marty did a phenomenal job. I wish I had that recorded. He did a great job of presenting that,
Mhm.
and a little longer than we normally do, and it was that interesting,
That's great.
So yeah. So you go to college, you get your degree, and then tell us what happened after that.
Well, so I did work at 417 Magazine for a year. I did kind of what I expected I was going to do. I was a staff writer there. But then I actually ended up moving to Norway, where I lived for 3 years. Unexpected. We all know life. Weird stuff can happen sometimes. This was one of those moments for me. There's kind of a long backstory to it, but the short version is I was dating a guy who was Norwegian, and he lived in Norway, and so I ended up moving there. Was terribly homesick the entire time. It was just awful not being at home. And anyway, but one of the things while I was there that really continued to stick out to me was how much I missed writing about the Ozarks.
Yeah.
And, could see things that were changing and people were passing away and all this stuff. And I was like, well, I'm not there to do it. And so ended up, when I moved back in 2015, I moved back in March. And in just like maybe a couple months later, I decided to start Ozarks Alive. And I figured at the time, I will say at the time, I actually was still working for my employer in Norway. I was in the communications department for an oil and gas excavation company, a whole other chapter of life that feels very far away at this point. But so I was working remotely for them and was starting to do this on the side, and was, my night and weekend hobby, as I called it at the time. And but quickly realized like how much I felt called even more to do this. And the internet, as much as there are challenges with the internet, made this possible for me in a way that I could never have done a few years ago.
Right. So Ozarks Alive was born in 2015.
Yes.
And kind of as a part-time gig. And for those of you that are not familiar with Ozarks Alive, you're going to be after today. We've got a little clip from her website that I wanted to show because I think it really sums up in picture and in words what Kaitlyn is all about. And it's well done piece that I'm sure she wrote. So, Mr. Producer Logan Fraker, would you play that video for our audience now?
You feel like you're in another world, almost.
Have you ever been to the Ozarks? I mean, really in it. Down those backwood roads only certain cars can travel, in little towns where history is still waiting to be told. These are the places and faces Kaitlyn McConnell lives for. McConnell is the founder of OzarksAlive.com, where she's bringing the history of the region to readers, one story at a time.
Ozarks Alive is what I would call an Ozarks preservation project. I started this a few years ago now. My goal was to be able to tell people about where they live and help them appreciate it more than they might have before. So I started doing stories about pieces of history, local unique places, just really things that I thought the world might want to know about.
Nearly every Saturday since 2015, she's been traveling roads and cities you've probably never heard of, logging over 40,000 miles on her car from her adventures. For McConnell, the reason is simple. She loved this area.
I would say that Ozarks Alive fundamentally is a project of passion, really. I have just loved this region for years now and really got interested in its history back in high school. I started seeking out old rural schoolhouses and old churches in Webster County and photographing them. And that eventually grew into me doing a column for the Marshfield Mail, the newspaper where I was from. Every week I'd write about a different historic site in the county, and that just blew things wide open for me. I just loved being able to tell a story, and it just showed me that there's so much value in preserving those things that are here today might not be here 10 years from now, and it's important that we grab a hold of them while we still have the chance.
Since its creation in 2015, McConnell estimates she's produced over 225 stories for the website. She intentionally looks for people in places that might not be obvious, so in many cases what you read on Ozarks Alive is the only place to find these stories.
One of the things I love most about doing these stories is the treasure hunt aspect behind a lot of them. You know, you have one little nugget, one little piece of information, but it takes going to the museum, asking locals, knocking on doors. I mean, there have been some stories. I literally have gone out and just knocked on people's doors in the middle of the country to see if they remember anything about a particular person or thing or whatever I'm writing about. And piecing those together, that's the train that sticks with me in my mind, and how much fun that was.
Part of the fun for McConnell is that she loves the process, no matter how hectic it keeps her life. A normal week involves a Monday through Friday 9-to-5 communications job, traveling on Saturday for the website, and then writing and publishing the story. And despite the chaotic pace, McConnell has no plans on slowing down.
I want to keep doing the stories. That's the thing I'm most passionate about, but I see other ways that the Ozarks need to be preserved, and I don't know what that's going to be right now, but I just know I want the site to keep continuing to evolve and progress as time goes on.
You can catch all the latest stories on the hidden gems of the Ozarks on OzarksAlive.com and on the website's Facebook page. And to both her longtime readers and the new ones popping up every day, McConnell has a message she'd like to add.
I just would really like to thank everybody for being interested in the Ozarks. I mean, that's part of why this is so much fun, is being able to connect with this community of people who really are passionate about the Ozarks and its history and culture. So just thank you. Thank you for being a part of it, and just encourage your friends. Explain to them maybe why the Ozarks is important, even if it's in little ways. We're all part of keeping this area, its history and its culture alive.
What a remarkable talent. That's a phenomenal video.
Oh, well,
It really is.
Oh, thank you. And I should give credit where credit is due. I actually did not write it. My friend and colleague, or someone who I'd gone to school with at Drury University, made it Bobby Miller.
Well.
So he deserves the credit for that. But I love what he did with it too.
Yes,
So.
absolutely phenomenal, and truly shows a reflection of your work. And I just kind of feel like I'm with a celebrity. No, I really do. I mean, this is you're quite a talent.
Thank you.
So prior to you beginning Ozarks Alive, you actually wrote your first book,
I did,
right?
yeah.
And we have a copy of it here, and some of you probably seen this in stores around bookstores. I've seen this series, this Images of America series, even in places like Walgreens and stores like that. Tell us about this work. This is a phenomenal book, by the way. If you like pictorial history of Marshfield, this is the book. It's phenomenal.
Well, thank you. You know, that I kind of joke about that feels like a different era of life almost, because you know that this came around started in 2010 whenever I started working on it and got the approval. At the time, Arcadia, which I assume still is doing similar stuff, although I haven't done any other projects with them, was looking for communities to have these pictorial histories done. And so I submitted an application for one on Marshfield, and they approved it. And so basically, you know, left it up to me in terms of the content. And, you know, that's what I spent a lot of time at the Webster County Historical Museum working on that. Particularly, it's a failing of mine that I should admit, but I'm a procrastinator. I always have been. And so as the deadline approached, there were some times, a few weeks in, I think, February of 2011, where I spent like 24/7 at the museum almost, it felt like, working on it. But it was a lot of fun. And yeah, like you said, it's broken down into a number of chapters that kind of focuses on specific areas of Marshfield's history. And it was a great way to try to visually show different aspects of the community. And yeah, it was a cool project.
Yeah, it's great. And some of these pictures, I've seen some of them, obviously. Of course, I was at the Carl Blessey Young Auditorium ribbon cutting. I'm back there. I'm not in the picture, but I'm back there with the rest of them. And a lot of these pictures I've never seen. And this one on the cover, do you know what that is?
You know, I have been told, and this is an embarrassing moment to admit I've forgotten, but I was one of the Historical Society's images, and they did, I think Linda Blazer did have an explanation at the time, but I cannot recall what it was. But it was just so cool, you know, to see those guys lined up like that.
Businessmen or something in town. It's really neat. And then you have written another couple of books. Tell us about those.
Yeah, so I have 2 books out that are complementary of each other. There's different content, but they're 2 different guidebooks to the region. And so, you know, people ask me, what would be a good thing to go do or place to see or whatever. And after a while, I was kind of like, well, maybe there's an appetite for having kind of a book that people could just look through. And so I ended up publishing the first one. I don't know if it was amazing timing or terrible, but it was the fall of 2019, which, you know, as a lot of the things, or at least a chunk of the things in that book, were outdoors based. You know, it was a good thing because with COVID, people were wanting road trips and go out. Also bad timing because it's like none of the indoor stuff was stuff that people really were able to do for a while. But then, so that it kind of was a spectrum of different things. You had, you know, history, food, nature, just quirky, random stuff. You know, kind of
sights and seats.
Yeah, all sites to go do stuff. You know, in the book, my goal was to give people a way to really experience the Ozarks. But, you know, for some folks who might not physically be able to get out or don't live here anymore, I also wanted it to be kind of a way they could connect from wherever they were. And, you know, so there was a lot of pictures and different things. One of the greatest compliments I got was from a lady who had written me and said that she'd gotten one for her mom who had dementia. But when she was able to look through it, she remembered places that she'd been.
Wow.
You know, that was just like so overwhelming.
That made it all worth it, didn't it?
It did.
That's great.
Yeah. And so that one was 2019, and then I did a second volume last year. So, you know, between the 2, there's around 130 places to go visit.
Wow, that's awesome. Cool. Great. And then you've also been on like the Ozarks video show and Color 10, and tell us about that.
Well, and that's been a, you know, really cool aspect of Ozarks Alive, is it's given me the chance to really connect with a lot of different people and places. And so yeah, I was able to be on the show. I guess it was last year. Got to share about Ozarks Alive. Have done, you know, TV appearances and things. To me, though, it is really all about helping educate more about the region. You know, it's really cool that I get to do it, but it's more about the people and their stories rather than me, in my opinion. But one of, you know, kind of a dotted line connected in all of that was that, you know, I was able to help with the Smithsonian Folklife Festival in Washington, D.C. this year.
I want to talk about that too.
Yeah, it was an amazing experience, and one that, you know, I know I'll remember forever. it was just, I think the moment that I've said this before, people are probably sick of me talking about it if they've heard me mention it, but you're just standing on the malls in DC, and also the Ozark stuff is behind me, and you have the Washington Monument on one side and the U.S. Capitol on the other, and it was just like, this is it. This is so cool to be able to see the region.
Ozarks have arrived, right?
That's right. And, you know, I probably should back up and just, for folks who may not have heard of the festival, basically what this is it's an annual festival in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall. It's been going since 1967. And every year highlights a different kind of folk culture. So sometimes it's a state, sometimes it's a region. It kind of varies from year to year. And this year they had two different themes. One was, if I can remember the title, Creative Encounters, Living Religions in the U.S., which was on the other side of the mall, but then the Ozarks was the only other focus on the whole side of the mall. And so there was around 70 people from the region that went and did demonstrations and had panel discussions about different cultural aspects that are from this area. And it was just really cool to see both the visitors come and be really engaged and want to learn and understand, but then even the participants, you know, having these hyper Ozarks people in one place for that long. It went on for 2 weeks, and a lot of them were there the entire time. Just, you know, kind of bond and learn from each other.
Right.
That was
The
really
Ozark
cool too.
did have us play, didn't
They did, yeah, July 4th.
Yeah,
It was like the ultimate Ozarks kind
Yeah.
of mashup in one place
Yeah.
on the National Mall on that very special day.
So when you talked about the Walking Preacher book with Guy Hawkins, is it?
Howard.
Guy
Yep.
Howard. So now my vision of that was very Ozarkian, like the Pentecostal evangelical movements of the 20s and 30s, and you know, during the Depression, people turned to religion, and you know, the gospel music became very prominent during that period, because again, the families would gather and sing gospel songs. My families did that up until the 70s even, but I can imagine that the influence that book had on you, that festival would be a kind of support that.
I mean, it did. They all kind of tie together,
Yeah,
you know.
exactly.
And with that book, you know, it's interesting. I reflected on this morning before I came here. I'd actually never reread it. I read it that one time and did not. But at this point, it's like I almost don't want to, because it's like been immortalized in a certain way in my mind, and I'm sure I would love it again. But
Might be a letdown.
yeah, or maybe just like, you know, I just love the memory of it so much that I haven't reread it. But to your point about, you know, the role of religion and music, it's so interesting to me as I do stories today, because those are still central things.
Oh yeah,
to
and the Ozarks especially. I mean, did you ever see the book or read the book that Wayne Glenn did at the Greatest Hits of the Ozarks?
I've looked through it, yeah.
Man, that's a great book, and it's amazing how all of the musicians that came through Springfield, from going back to those days of I don't even know what you call hillbilly music. They called it gospel hillbilly, tie together to the Daredevils of the 70s, and then beyond, Cy Simon and Ralph Foster and all those connections, and many of them family connections. It's a really interesting book. I'd highly recommend that if any of you are interested in the music of the Ozarks. You know.
Well, and I think, you know, for me, I guess when I'm trying to tell stories too, there's a lot of it that's just what is happening right this moment, and why are we talking about it? But there's often kind of a layer of context as to like, why are we talking about this today? Why is this happening? And, you know, when you go into music and religion, you know, and I always give the disclaimer, you know, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a historian, as much as I love history. A lot of what I kind of think of in terms of is through a journalistic lens and maybe a common sense lens, if I can kind of joke about that, I guess, what makes most sense. And to me, I look at my grandmother's life growing up in the middle of nowhere, Webster County. You needed something to do, you know, and religion obviously was, you know, more deeper than that. But in terms of the music, that was a huge element of a lot of people's lives. It was not for my grandmother, because they were Free Will Baptists, and you know, music wasn't, and dancing, that wasn't something they did. But for a lot of people in the Ozarks, music was a very default source of entertainment. And I think that's been why it's carried through so long and even made it to the national stage through all those other places you mentioned.
I think gospel was very dominant in the families, in the homes, because country music in the early days sort of had a honky tonk connection that many families didn't really want to be a part of, you know. But gospel's something they could sit around the radio and listen to on Saturday nights in the 40s or the 50s, and as the variety shows started and so forth, that didn't have, you know, you could sing gospel music and there wasn't any worry about you singing about some guy cheating on his wife or, you know, crying in their beer or whatever.
Right.
So I think that's why it was so dominant in our part of the country.
Well, and even you kind of have that split too when you get into fiddle music, because, you know, going back to like people being, you know, not comfortable with square dancing, but also not comfortable with fiddling because it was simply seen as like the devil's music, as the devil's instrument. And lots of those ideas kind of feed into how things evolved.
We didn't even have rock and roll yet. Don't worry about that. So. And then Color 10, do you still do those?
You know, we don't do those anymore. They changed their programming format, so we've paused those.
You were doing that kind of regularly, weren't you?
Monthly, did those for a while.
You've been the president of the Webster County Historical Society, and that was back earlier on.
I was my freshman year of college.
Yeah.
I don't know, looking back, that anybody would say I should have won an award for being like the best president, because I didn't have a clue what I was doing, but they put up with me for a year, which I'm grateful for.
They're a great organization, and they're, again, a much needed organization that we kind of take for granted. They do their job, and they have their role in preserving history here in Webster County for sure. The journals they put out, the publications,
I've been involved in some of those.
Those are really good little books.
They are.
I've frequently mentioned on the show. So, I think I'd like to ask you, and I know we've talked about this a little bit, the one thing that you have seemed to focus on is real people. You know, doing stories on people that are real, and not necessarily, you know, I think you were asked in one of the shows about if you had your opportunity to interview someone, who would you like to interview? And I think most people would say, well, the Queen of England or, you know, one of the presidents or something. But your answer was?
Normal people, everyday people, you know, people especially of the past. Because in my mind, you know, those are not that people who are famous don't have real stories, but, you know, you really get a better impression of what normal life, average life is maybe. For people when you talk to folks who are living it every day in just a very conventional, authentic way. And I think that's why, you know, there's been a lot of popularity around things like Humans of New York and, you know, some of those online platforms where it's just about telling a story in someone's own words. And, you know, I don't always do that in terms of, there's a lot of times I write a story in a more newspaper style rather than just a bunch of quotes from somebody. But it's like people I think are hungry for that authentic look into life, and you know, through things maybe good or bad, things like reality TV shows, how that's changed our appetite for behind the scenes looks. I think those all tie together. But to me, I love it because it's really about those normal people.
Right. And do you think because of social media, because of the toxic environment of our political spectrum today, do you think that that's why people have a real yearning and a connection for real stories and real people? Because certainly we don't have that like we used to when you turn on the television or listen to the media or social media with politics. It's all, you know, everything's a soundbite. Politics used to all be local. But now politics are national. If you don't support this candidate that is this certain way, doesn't matter if you're with him 90% of the time. You got to be with him 100% of the time, or you're not a true Republican or a true Democrat, you know, or whatever. And it's just a whole different animal that we didn't have before social media.
And you know, it's a mess. Bottom line, but you know, it's hard to think about things like that and see all the different aspects to it. There's a part of me that's grateful for the technology and how
Sure,
that's changed things, because
absolutely.
without it, I would not be able to do this. I would not have been able to start doing this without startup money and be able to print it, or things that would have been required in the past to do a magazine, or so to speak, what I'm doing with stories. But there is so much fracture, and there's so much division in our society, and that makes things, I think, difficult in a lot of senses. But there is this hunger for something that's simpler. And I will say, like, going back to context, the past was not simple. We think it was. We think that everything was great, and there were a lot of things that were better. You're talking about keeping things more local. I think our brains are not wired to even be able to, absorb all of the news that's thrown at us through things like social media. We were able to understand and be more invested when it was more local.
Mm-hmm.
But, whether it always makes sense or not, there is this desire to feel connected and maybe have, it sounds kind of corny, but like, soul satisfying, meaning of life, salt of the earth type connections. And that'll probably continue, I think.
I think so too. My most favorite example to give when I hear people talk about the good old days, and yearning for the good old days. And, you're right. They weren't all quite so good. Ask the mothers of the boys that didn't come home from Vietnam or World War II. I don't know that they would say that those were better days than today. So it's all sort of relevant, and we kind of have to think about it. But certainly there's a lot of things about days gone by that were better, and I think social media, as you mentioned, it's a great tool, just like television's a great tool. Computers are great tools, but there's certain things about them, elements of them that maybe aren't so good. So
I think they take away the simplicity of life in a way
Exactly.
that makes it very
and
difficult.
that's what you're doing, is trying to kind of remind us of the simplicity of life.
And maybe try to remind people that we have more in common than we think about sometimes. You talk about the political divisions and different things, and it's like, it's easy to see everybody else who doesn't agree 100% of the time with you as the other.
Exactly.
And it's like,
you're either with me or you're not.
And it's like, we're really all on a spectrum. Now we're getting like way off topic from Ozarks Alive, but I think that comes through, I try to help that come through, that reminding people that we don't have to be enemies all the time, or we don't have to be skeptical of what someone thinks or whatever. We're really all on this planet together, and we need to get along, and we need to figure out how to make things work.
That's exactly. And your stories do that. Your stories pull us back together, and you remind us of the connection. If you're doing a story about a real person in Galena, Missouri, or a real person in Theodosia, Missouri, or Niangua, Missouri, we can all relate to that. And I think that's why what you do is important. It's important for future generations, because a lot of those kinds of stories I can maybe relive or remember from my childhood, or maybe you can't even. But how many generations after us will have no clue?
Right.
And so we got to get this documented. We got to get these stories on paper and on film and in podcasts.
Well, and I completely agree, and I'll say too, like, I think that those stories are one aspect, and that's why I love the podcast that you're doing. But it's also simply about helping people form relationships. And I think of like what you're doing with the school building, and having a place for people to meet, come together. That's another thing that in our virtual world we just don't have as much of. And so I think it's harder to have division when you know somebody, when you've seen them face to face. And maybe even through the podcast, hearing someone's story makes a difference, but it definitely does when you have a relationship because you met here for some reason and become friends or whatever.
And there's another thing that you touched on earlier when you and I were talking before the show, thinking about what life was like for that lady in the 1920s in rural Webster County. And even sitting in this room, what were the hands of the gentleman that put that knotty pine paneling on the wall? And then the guy that came and finished it, and the time they took to make sure every piece of trim was cut perfectly, and why there's a hole over there in the brick. I've often wondered that. Why is that hole in that brick? You can stick your hand down there and shine a flashlight. It's like they had a secret stash place or something. I don't know, but those are the kind of questions that you ask
Yeah.
every day in your work. And I think I just really think it's interesting.
I think that, thank you. And I think the frustrating part though is that like we probably will never know.
No,
Like,
we
some of
won't
these
know.
questions,
We
they're
won't
just
know.
gone. You won't know, but you can try to find out
But
as much as you
if
can.
there had been a note down in there when I looked in there with the flashlight that said, this hole was here because I used to keep money here or something, but
Well, that illustrates a really good point that I think about through storytelling is that there's so much about our world that we assume future generations will know.
Yeah.
And it's like, as soon as somebody's gone or as soon as a generation's gone, that like inherent automatic programmed knowledge, so to speak, where were the businesses on the square? What did the
Right.
street, that's not necessarily passed down.
that's right.
And so it needs to be documented.
Yeah. And somebody's got to do it.
Mm.
So you're doing it. I'm trying to do
Yeah.
it. Not as well as you, but
No.
but I'll get there someday maybe. You're on the Missouri Arts Council.
I am.
Tell us about that.
Well, I'll tell you, if you have me back in the future, I'll tell you more because I've actually not been to a board meeting yet.
Okay.
The first
So they
meeting,
quarterly or something?
yeah, they're 3 times a year. The
Yeah.
first one is actually next week, so
Yeah.
mid-October, so
Yeah.
it's. So I will know more then. But the board, is reports to the lieutenant governor. It's the kind of oversight for advocacy for arts across the state, and so I'm really excited to be able to help represent.
Yeah.
Technically it's I represent the entire state, but I'm the board member in Springfield, which
Right. Yeah.
makes me really happy that I get to kind of bring a voice for
Yeah,
local
absolutely.
work.
It's great to have Marshfield and Webster County on the map and representing our part of the state for sure. Let me ask you.
Mm.
Let's talk about this building because that's part of what we do. So growing up here in Marshfield, what are some of your favorite memories? Maybe at school, you didn't go to this building, but in Marshfield High School or even around town, maybe friendships you might have had growing up, things you and your family did. Did you take family vacations? Tell us a little bit about growing up in Marshfield.
Well, I give the disclaimer that I'm an extremely nostalgic person, and so like some things I probably will say people are like she's crazy, but it's for me, high school, junior high school especially, I loved small town life. I was involved in everything at school. You look through the yearbook and it's like, how could she been in so many clubs? And probably because I was not a very good member of some of them, but I wanted to be involved as much as I could be. Was very involved in band. I was trumpet player. I played all the way, actually through college. I played at jury as well on scholarship. Was a drum major, so was very involved in marching band and all of that as well. And to me, it's like even I was in town yesterday actually, and I drove by the football field. So I hope that there's a game tonight because even just the atmosphere, like there's, to be honest, I attended every home football game for 4 years, and I still don't understand how the game works. But it was the concept of like being there,
right,
and the small town atmosphere, and going to basketball games and things like that. You find that in small towns. You don't find that in places that aren't small towns. And I think for me, that's what I look back on. It's like these community moments that you just see people, you feel these connections, that your experiences are shared, even if you don't have exactly the same life. It's, you have this moment in time, you're all together. And, to me, looking back, those are some of my best memories and that I carry with even when I just drive through town today. I think, I also have very fond memories of younger years too. I mean, you can tell I liked history because my 3rd grade class, I was one of the last classes to have 3rd grade in Hubble before they began shifting buildings regularly. And our room still had an actual blackboard, which was not normal then, but somehow we still had one. And so I got, regularly would go out and bang the erasers and had some experience that probably most people like generations
You got to
before
clean
me
the
did.
erasers. That was an honor, right?
And we had like that thing you'd put the chalk in to like get the lines for cursive and all that.
Yeah, for music, the staff.
Oh yeah, too.
If I recall, it was like 5 of them. Fingers. That's cool.
Yeah. But and I guess not the last, there were other memories, of course, but of course the 4th of July. It's even forever will be like the epitome of small town America, and actually that's in the guidebook is one of the things people should go see.
Yeah, it's the crown jewel.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just no question about it. And we talked about this in previous broadcasts, but the opportunity to have the President of the United States walk our parade, that's another thing. I mean, about 4 or 5 things about that made it so unique that probably, and I think Roy Beck, another famous journalist from Marshfield, stated this at the Cherry Blossom Festival in the interview that he did with Mayor Plunkett and Presiding Commissioner Roast and Linda Dickinson. I mean, he said the fact that we were able to have the president walk a parade in a small town in rural Missouri on the 4th of July may have not ever been done like that in any other town. I mean, if you think about where presidents normally are at, they're at National Harbor in D.C. or Camp David or traveling somewhere, but to walk a rural Missouri parade is just so unique that it kind of puts us on the map. And I've often thought about that.
That's true.
Yeah. Kaitlyn, this has just been such a treasure and such a treat for me to have you here today. There's a famous quote. It's probably, if not my most favorite quote. It's one of the most favorite quotes of mine. And the quote is, it was by a Harvard business teacher, professor. His name was Peter Drucker. About 10 years ago or so, I think, is when it was published, the quote. And the quote is, the actual quote is there's a modified version that I use. The version I use is culture trumps strategy. I think the original one was something like culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Okay.
And if you do your research on that, and this is a Harvard business guy, a professor that's teaching business. He basically says that no matter how much you put into developing a system to be successful, culture is still the most important thing. And I'm a believer in that. And I think what you do and what I would like to do and try to do is to preserve that culture and make sure that future generations understands how important that is. And so it's just really a treasure and an honor to have you in here today. We still got about 10 more minutes. So I know we talked about someone had asked you, we mentioned, who you would really like to interview, and you said a real person. But out of all of the stories you've done, there has to be a favorite.
Well, the one that, I always do go back to on that is a lady that I met out in Douglas County back in 2016, I think. But, she was one of these people I'd heard about through somebody else I'd written about. I would have probably never known about her otherwise. But her name was Thea Porter, and she ran a restaurant in the tiny community of Squires, which really doesn't exist anymore. But she, at the
Is there
time...
still a restaurant there?
No, we'll get to the end of this in a minute. But she...
Okay, sorry. We didn't interrupt you.
No, you're fine. The reason that she was noteworthy at the time as a possible story was, I think she was 87 or 88 and still single-handedly ran this restaurant all by herself.
Wow.
And she'd been doing this since she was in her 30s when she opened the restaurant. And it was, all these, great roller coaster moments that she was able to overcome to keep the restaurant open. Back in the 70s, they rerouted the highway and she moved the restaurant, and then it burned, and then she rebuilt it. And then a few years before I met her, she fell and broke a hip, but came right back, and all these things. And she was still there, and she would, was the only employee. She baked all the pies. She made all the food, was open at the time I met her 6 days a week.
Wow.
And it was just so inspiring to me, both because, of course, it's unusual and really noteworthy, but just because it was a continuation of what she'd always done. And to me, it goes back to that authenticity point. It's like we think of some things as old time or country or, people, there's nothing wrong with that, but trying to make focus on this has been here a long time and that's why we should celebrate it. But for her, she just
her life.
Just her life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got the chance. I wrote about her at that point, although she was one of those people who was convinced she didn't have a story until we talked about it. She changed her mind and allowed me to interview her. But wrote about her at least 3, 4, maybe 4 times over the years. Every time she'd have a birthday, I'd do another story until, unfortunately, she passed away in late 2019, and then the restaurant closed. And the building's still there, but it's not open anymore. Which, in my mind, also goes back to that community question we were talking about before about helping what brings people together. You know, we need these places in small towns because there used to be a group of people who met at a restaurant all the time.
Yeah.
Where are they meeting now? I don't know.
Right.
I don't know if they are meeting now. And it's like, if we don't have those gathering spaces, that we lose a little bit of our culture all the time by not having those connections. And so for all those reasons, Theta's story is one I probably will forever go back to as one of my top favorites over the years, just because I think she represented a lot of things that I am hoping to learn about myself and recognize. And so she's one that I'll always go back to. You know, anything that's really tucked away and unexpected is always really fun for me. And there's another one that's probably close to the second favorite, which actually was in that video. It's this little place called Champion. And it's actually, weirdly enough, also in Douglas County. But it is a tiny community. You know, Douglas County is very rural to begin with, but you drive out, you go off like 3 highways, and at the end of the pavement, it's literally on the gravel road right past the pavement, is this little town. And there's this general store there that still operates as a regular general store would. As in, like, I've been in there and people go buy feed there. You know, it's like, this is not just a landmark, it's actually functional part of the community. But the reason it's survived, in my mind, is because it's so far away from everything else. And so, like, the biggest towns in this world are Ava and Mountain Grove, but they're both 30 minutes away.
Yeah.
So people still go there, you know, to buy things or to...
It's like a convenience store, yeah.
And so I go out there pretty regularly too, because it's this, you know, a gathering place as well. People are there, they still have a wood stove. Like, it's very, you know, otherworldly in an Ozarks old time sense. And so
cool.
that, you know, some people might be like, why are you excited about a general store? But to me, it's also this example of our culture that we just don't see as much anymore.
Right. Well, it seems, you know, like things do cycle. I mean, we're seeing more activity, I think, in some of the smaller stores, like, you know, Elkland, I understand, is getting a Dollar General. Niang was getting one. I mean,
Niang was getting a Dollar General?
That's what I've heard.
I had not heard
That's
that.
the rumor, yeah. So, convenience stores, you know, opening in little towns like that. I don't know. It just seems like maybe there's a little bit of revival in some of that. I mean, not to the point it was before, and certainly many years ago, a lot of those places, you know, pretty well dried up. But that's encouraging to a community to have that.
I mean, and that's the thing. I've joked about the Dollar General, like, they're growing so fast. It's the, you know, huge crop in the Ozarks right now.
Great, though.
I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's not a bad thing because it helps people in those rural areas.
Right.
You know, I think, and well, I'll keep this short because I know we need to wrap things up, but maybe a topic for another time is, what does the evolving Ozarks look like? And that's something I wonder about all the time when I'm driving around on back roads, because, you know, I've gotten the sense from people I've talked with out in the region, but also seen it myself, everything or a lot of things are for sale. People are coming to the Ozarks wanting to have land, have natural resources from other parts of the country. That's, you know, a bigger issue for them in a way it's not for us. So what is the physical Ozarks going to look like in 20 or 30 years? You know,
scary.
It'll be different. Whatever it is, it'll be different. And, you know, I tell people, it probably sounds depressing maybe, but, you know, they ask, well, what should we go see right now? Sometimes I tell them, you should just go drive around and enjoy what it looks like, because not that seeing it built up, like, that's not all bad. I'm sure it's a lot of good people who are moving here, but these vistas, and, you know, I don't think that'll be the same way 20 or 30 years from now.
Well, if you look at plat maps, look at a plat map of Webster County from like 1909. I think they did one around that year. And then you look at one in 1940, and then look at one in 1980, and then look at one today. I mean, you had sections of land, looked like a quilt, right? Yeah. Now it's just unbelievable. And these farms that we even knew, dairy farms and big farms that, you know, go up and down various roads, they've all been divided into 3-acre tracts. So there's only so much land.
That's right.
And so 50 years from now, it is going to look a lot different. And it's scary, but that's progress. That's how civilization, that's how civilization moves forward, whether we like it or not. Any final thoughts for the audience? This has just been a real treat, and I hope to have you back.
Oh, I would love that.
And we'll talk some more about what's going on in your life. What do you have planned for the future beyond what you're doing now?
Well, and one thing we didn't touch on that I'll just briefly mention because that kind of helps with that question is, I mentioned when I started Ozarks Alive, I did this as a night and weekend thing for the company I worked with in Norway, and I actually shortly after that began working as the PR media contact for Cox Health, and so I did that for going on 7 years, and it wasn't until January of 2022 when I left my full-time job and began doing this, I say Ozarks Alive and related work full-time. And so kind of my structure now is I do accept contributions and sell books and those sorts of things, but most of my income, it comes through kind of some contracts that I do with other companies. I work for the Community Foundation of the Ozarks as the writer in residence. I do work for the Ozark Studies Institute at MSU. So those are kind of focuses that are ongoing, but also in terms of just storytelling, I have, a weekly story that I do for the most part. I have the Facebook page where I post things throughout the week. And really, I'm kind of at a point of just what you asked, evolving. What is the next step in terms of storytelling? Mediums change all the time.
Yeah.
What are some other methods that might be helpful? And so that's where I'm at, and hopefully next time we talk, I will have a very firm answer to tell you.
Okay, great. Well, like a TV show.
Yeah, cliffhanger.
That'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. Well, I've thought about you, and then you think about great Marshfield journalists. Obviously, Jack Waters, and filmer,
Yes.
Marshfield graduate. Of course, Chad Day, Marshfield's only Pulitzer Prize winner, I'm sure. You're following some big footsteps, and you're right there with them now. So think about that.
That means a lot to hear you say that.
Natalie Nunn on Keller 10, Marshfield grad. We've got pretty rich heritage here, so yeah.
Yeah, it's a privilege to be able to do it, and I think about how things fit together and how it evolves and leads somewhere, and I will always go back to that Marshfield male start and that, and the greater community too, because if I hadn't had these family connections here, I probably would never have had the interest or evolved in the way that I have. I'm grateful for that.
Right. I want a copy of your passport to the Ozarks, both copies. So if you've got them in the car, okay.
But I can get them.
I know you can get them. I want a copy of each. I don't have those. I have the other book, but and anyone out there, go to Ozarks Alive. I'm sure they can get one, purchase one through that website. Let's follow Kaitlyn. Let's support her as she advances in her career and her life going forward. It'll be fun to watch.
Thank you.
And you're welcome back here anytime. If you need to borrow a room here at the school to have a presentation or to do a podcast or a seminar, you're more than welcome.
Thank you very much.
We consider you one of our own. So.
Thank you.
I don't know where Mr. Producer went. We got 1 minute, but I think that's about going to wrap it up.
Okay.
So,
well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Remember, culture trumps strategy.
Thank you.
I'm going to have that put on the wall. I'm going to remind people of that every week.
People's emotions always tied to action more than anything else.
That's right. Thank you.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Yeah. We'll see y'all next week.